recording, and I'm just recording to this computer. But as we'll see if others join in on us. I was a little concerned that the link that I set out because I actually did a last minute quit the meeting, went back and rejoined through the link that I had sent out just to make sure. And because I started things up and was testing things out, as early as about quarter two, I think is when I first got everything up and operating. So we may as well get started. So let us pray. Loving God, it has been a long journey. We sit upon 2 millennia of history. And so as we explore that, or at least the early parts of that, open us up to learning something new. Help us to gain a perspective that perhaps we may not have otherwise been aware of. Surround us with your love and peace tonight, we pray. Guide us and give us a spirit of learning, we pray. In Christ's name. Amen. All right. Well, welcome. I'm going to get started. I know there were a few people said that they're interested, but wouldn't be able to meet on this first night. So hopefully, as we go forward, we can look at this. So as typical of what I've done with this style, I'm just doing I know the first night is an overview, but here also is an overview of how the whole thing is going to look. Is that we start today, of course, with the introduction and the overview. Next week we talk about specifically Christianity and the Roman Empire and how that evolved. This is this is mostly sequential in terms of different time periods. So hopefully that some of that'll but when we get to talking about what the Roman Empire actually is, that gets complicated when in terms of its history with Christianity, and they are actually they are linked. And then on November 4th we have evolution and migration, which there was a lot happening in that next period. And notice I haven't put any dates down. Not worried about that. Then it's Remembrance Day, so there's nothing on Remembrance Day itself. And then start on November 18th, we have what referring to as the so-called Dark Ages. They aren't as and actually there is quite an interesting time. And then we move into, from that, it just segues nicely isn't quite the right word for it, but what eventually became the split between East and West. Now, as we go through this course, you'll actually learn that even though the so-called Great Schism, which we're actually going to be talking about in just a few minutes, during the 11th century, wasn't the first kind of overall split in Christianity itself, but it is the major one as to why there is a Eastern Orthodox Church and a Roman Catholic Church. And so we are going to get to that. So what I'm going to do is just start with where things. This is where we're ultimately going. Is that the end date, I guess, if you can call it that, is 1054. So almost 1,000 years ago. So we're, like in 30 years, like, it's 1,000 years ago minus 30 years. So 970 years ago. And this was a very important and significant year in the history of Christianity. And curiously enough, this also predates the First Crusade by approximately 40 years. And this sets up the circumstances for the First Crusade. But we're not covering the Crusades in this at all. But it's an important setup for that. And at this point, this actually was the point at which the Western Latin-speaking church and the Eastern Greek-speaking church formally split. It became known as the Great Schism. And probably, even though the Protestant Reformation, at least from our reference point, for those of us from either a Roman Catholic or a Protestant background, which came 500 years later, this one was actually probably, if anything, was actually in some ways more significant. But it's not the one that we talk about, because most of us, our backgrounds come out of Western Europe. In other words, it comes out of being on one half of this split already. And as I said, we'll get to the details of this in week 5, but suffice to say, what you need to know is that there was a series of disputes that, and coupled with this, a personal feud between the cardinal from Rome and the patriarch of the Byzantine Church, based out of Constantinople, and it spiraled out of control. And what ended up happening, to make a long story short, is that the Roman cardinal excommunicated the patriarch of the Byzantine Church, and the Byzantine Church replied by doing the same thing the other way around. And so they basically excommunicated each other. And that has been basically the state for the past 1,000 years now. But the thing is, the circumstances for this split have been building over centuries. And curiously enough, one of the reasons why this date is particularly significant is it's almost exactly 1,000 years after Paul penned his first letter to the Thessalonians, which is the very first Christian writing that we actually have. And I'm gonna get to that in a moment. So the question is, how do we get here? How did we get from the earliest stages of Christianity to this split between the Eastern and the Western Church? And so what we're going to be talking about is themes and trends are more important than dates. The one thing about approaching this from the perspective of a historians, dates are okay. Dates are marker points, but they're not the things you need to necessarily memorize. You need to understand the overarching arc and the circumstances of what those trends were. And that's what I'm kind of hoping to convey with this. And as per usual, there's no such thing as a stupid question. There's never a bad time to ask it. So if you have a question, interrupt me, say, and wave your hand around. If you want to use the little raise your hand function on this, by all means. But I'm happy to address whatever question that you have. Richard, you got your hand.
Yes. It took me a while to figure out what schism was.
Yes. Schism, of course.
You couldn't just say split.
Yeah, but it has the formal name of the Great Schism, because schism seems to be this just word because it's used more than once throughout church history, and but it does mean a split.
Yes. I intend to use it soon when I speak to my cousin in England.
Yes. Absolutely. So, but another thing is, like, we also talk about different themes, is that, how did Christianity become an offshoot of another religious tradition, specifically Judaism, and how it was one of the many, many different mystery religions that existed under Roman imperial rule. And then how did it then become the official religion of the Roman Empire, when the Roman Empire did actually have its own full-on pantheon, and it became the official religion of the Roman Empire and all of its various successor states, and also how it also existed as a non-official religion under external rule, and largely that's in the area of the Eastern Church. And the Eastern Church isn't as monolithic like you'll find that when we go through this eventually, not necessarily tonight, that when we start talking about the Eastern Church, it isn't just this monolithic thing. But with the rise of Islam, it sort of became kind of that way. Aha! So we just had the Donna join us, and hi Megan.
Hi.
Welcome. Like you're labeled as Donna, but I'm assuming now is Donna there too, or is it just you tonight?
Mom's here.
Okay, so
Yeah.
welcome. So what I'll do is I'll just do a very brief recap of the slides that I just put on. But hi Donna.
Hi.
So we're just basically what I talking about the overarching arch that what we're talking about now is where we're ultimately getting to is that so at the end of this, by the time that we get to the date of 1054, that you hopefully understand how we got here, and specifically because in 1054 the reason that that's important is a sort of twofold reason, is that it specifically marks what is called the Great Schism, or the major split between the Latin-speaking Western Church, what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church, and the Eastern Greek-speaking Church, which we largely refer to as the Eastern Orthodox traditions. But so it is a little bit more complex than that. But this also comes that almost exactly 1,000 years after the earliest Christian writing we have, which is the intact writing that we have, which is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, that was written approximately in year 54 in the first century. And so these are things that we're going to be exploring. These are the how did we get here? So so I'm saying this is where we're going. Now it's a case of we're going to go back and how did we actually get here? So, all right. So first thing is just one of the things where Christianity started out as simply an offshoot of a movement inside Judaism. Now this may be obvious, but it was as what's called a messianic movement, specifically focused around the person and work of Jesus of Nazareth. But the thing is, in the Eastern Roman Empire, there would be various political circumstances, and it would evolve. Christianity would itself evolve into an independent mystery religion separate from Judaism, and it stemmed off from there. But a lot of that had to do with the circumstances into which it grew. So I'll be talking about this, and part of this is we also have some blank spots that we're going to try and work through. Now tonight, Donna, is primarily an overview. So today is just sort of the broad overview, talking about what we're doing in terms of different ways of like understanding the history, and then we're going to get into some of the more specifics. We'll cover a little bit of it tonight, but with each successive night, and we're basically every Monday night except for Remembrance Day between now and the end of November. So anyway, one of the things that we do have is we've got this blank spot that between what we understand to be the date of the crucifixion of Jesus to Paul writing his first letter to the Corinthians, to the Thessalonians in approximately 54. There is about a 20-year gap where there's not really a written record. I mean, or at least we don't actually have intact documents from this particular time. That doesn't mean that there weren't any, but they're not in the way that we think that we are. So we're going to do some piecing together, and some of the things. Now, this is me putting a historian's hat on as opposed to the pastor's collar. and some of the things that we talk about, historians often talk about different sources. For example, what are called primary documents. Primary documents are basically, the idea is that they're examples of particular writings that happened at a given time, that are a reflection of the time period into which they were written. And so, for example, a newspaper is an example of a primary document, whereas a history book writing about a certain period is referred to as a secondary source. So a lot of what we're looking at are so, for example, the letters of Paul, one of the non-canonical Christian writings called the Didache, gives some insights in this as well, and Revelation. All of these represent what are called primary sources, because the letters of Paul are addressing issues at Paul's time. The Didache, same deal, and Revelation, believe it or not, do not like with I've done Revelation as a study before, but Revelation is a direct commentary on the political situation that is happening at the time. And it's just a little harder to pull that out. But if you know what to look for, it actually becomes a lot easier. On the other hand, we have secondary documents, and these are the written about people in the past. They're often done with a theological reflection. So, for example, as I mentioned before, a history book is an example of a secondary source. In some respects, things like historical fiction can also be a secondary source, because it can, even though it may not necessarily be accurate in terms of some of the precise details, it may give you an insight into that kind of perspective. So the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, and Josephus's Antiquities are examples of secondary sources. They're still valuable, but they're not sort of like the direct things in the same way, because what these things are doing, like the Gospels, are trying to recount and convey the life and work of Jesus, but from after the fact. So like, whereas Paul is writing directly to a situation currently. I don't know if that makes it as clear as mud or what have you, but it's an important distinction. By the way, there's no such thing as Richard's about to ask a question. I'm going to give it to him in a sec. But Donna, same thing. You can ask a question at any time. There's no such thing as a stupid question. So please.
You're going to find out that in 2 minutes.
So, Richard.
Now, this is all still 20 years after the crucifixion of Christ, correct?
Yes, at least as far.
You're not filling in those 20 years. You're just now picking up from where technically Judaism and Christianity split.
Well, we will cover the split between Judaism and Christianity, because that actually begins to happen during some of this primary documentation time.
Yeah, but this is all about documents. I'm after actual to figure it out within my head is the time frame.
Yeah.
So it's all still 20 years after.
In terms of primary documentation, yes, but there are some very educated guesses that we can make. And curiously enough, the split between Judaism and Christianity wasn't so much a cutoff line here. It's more of a, by the time you get to this point, there are two distinct groups. And so it's not like in the case of the Great Schism, where you can actually point to a date and say, because these two officials got in a fight, we can date the split to that. We can put the date of that split here. Whereas the difference between Judaism and Christianity, it's more of a movement. So some of the time period with the documentation we have will actually show that starting to happen. I hope that's and it may not be clear, but I hope to go through that. So, as I said, this is primarily a historical exploration, but we do talk and we do use biblical scholarship, particularly when it comes to the New Testament. So we are doing something with the New Testament. What we're using date ranges that are consistent with a scholarly consensus. And I'm, in terms of majority of majority of biblical scholars where they kind of think where these documents land. I do have a friend and colleague who might put the dating of these earlier. Um, but what I'm working with is largely scholarly consensus, and it doesn't necessarily change things, because by the time we get to the end of the first century, we're still kind of in that overall mode. So now here's the distinction. The earliest intact gospel that we have is the Gospel of Mark, and it dates to approximately the middle of the first century, maybe 16 years sort of after the exact midpoint, but about 33 years after the crucifixion of Christ. It happens around the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, approximately. Now, that does put a 33-year gap between the crucifixion of Christ and when this was written. Now, when I say intact, that means in its present form. But the thing is, Mark was clearly drawing on some degree of earlier traditions, whether it is what's called an oral tradition, or whether it is a separate written tradition. There seems to be that, and not only that, as I mentioned in my sermons, Mark is also written in the present tense, so it's written more like a play, where the action is unfolding as you're watching it, as opposed to recounting something in the past, where Luke and Matthew, and John for that matter, the sort of put it into the past, whereas Mark tries to engage people as if the events are unfolding as you're watching them, but it's still, in terms of time period, approximately right around this time. And so the other thing is, the Acts of Apostles is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, so it has to come after or around the same time as the Gospel of Luke, and you've got a wide date range here that we're not entirely sure of, so that these are only approximations. But the other thing is that you have to remember that the Gospels didn't just simply appear. Okay, contrary to what the people say, oh, they just made it all up, and it just suddenly appeared at this particular point in time. Things do not appear out of a vacuum. From a historian's point of view, there's always something to which it is coming out of, and so the Gospels themselves evolved out of something called a passion narrative. In other words, the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, and also combined with a separate tradition, not necessarily entirely separate, but a different like a different stream of that tradition that was conveying the teachings of Jesus in terms of what he taught, as well as some of what are called referred to as the miracle stories as well. So you have Mark trying to bring all of that together, and they sort of existed somewhat independently of each other. Now, at the same time, me talking about this, I realize this might cause a bit of theological discomfort, because quite often the Gospels are referred to as eyewitness accounts, and some base their credibility on them being eyewitness accounts, that they were basically videotaped versions of what had happened, and the thing is, any degree of scrutiny says that's not the case. But what they are theological reflections, theological questions. They are conveying a very special message, and it does not in any way downgrade their validity in understanding early Christianity. So from a historian's point of view, curiously enough, in understanding not Christianity as a whole, but in understanding the development of Christianity, because of primary documentation, looking at Paul is very important, because in some ways it's kind of easier to pull some of that information because you're looking at what Paul was dealing with at the time, whereas in looking at, say, Mark or Matthew or Luke or John, that requires a little bit more in-depth reading of trying to pull out what situations they were addressing. So now the other thing is, this is not a course in the formation of the New Testament. I did do that already, but I am touching on it a little bit. So anyway, so what I want to do is hopefully, going back to your question, Richard, in terms of how did we get from Judaism to Christianity? And so that's hopefully we're going to where we're going to be at. And so what we're looking at here is approximately 20-ish years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. We have this Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, because it is the oldest intact piece of canonical scripture, and it gives us a bit of an insight into early Christianity. And so one of the things to remember at this point in time, the snapshot here and the people that Paul are working with, Paul himself, born and raised within Judaism, but he is working with people who never were Jewish in the first place. Largely, and the broad phrase we use for that is Gentile. So at this point in time, Christianity, at least in Asia Minor, and there is a map coming up, by the way, so you don't have to worry about this too much. Because Asia Minor is now what is modern day Turkey. So largely in Greece, around the Aegean Sea, and in what is now modern day Turkey, and modern day Turkey is Asia Minor. Christianity at this point is a movement within these non-Jewish groups, at least in this area. It's not to say that there weren't versions of Jewish Christianity, because there were, but they were elsewhere. And so at this point in time, at least by the time that Paul's working, they had developed a character separate from, but they were drawing on those common sacred texts. And most likely, like for example, Paul worked with and very likely had copies of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, referred to as the Septuagint, that he had in his hand. So because most of the time when he appears to be quoting from Scripture, he is actually quoting the Greek version, because we do actually have copies of that Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. And I think the other thing is, and I don't necessarily have a slide for this. One of the things that Paul, and here, this is just an aside, one of the things that Paul is assumed to be, like you've heard the term, Paul was a tent maker. Okay. Well, that may indeed be true. It seems to be but the other thing Paul was that many others at the time were not, was literate. And so someone who sewed tents for a living, it doesn't seem very logical that they would be themselves able to read and write. But another way that the phrase tent maker can be translated is one who prepares hides, because tents were made out of hides. Well, something else that you make with hides are scrolls. Okay, or specifically the type of, or what is now known as parchment. Parchment, you think of just being like a piece of paper, but parchment actually is a prepared animal hide. The Dead Sea Scrolls, most of them are written on parchment, in other words, animal hides. And so, and if that's what Paul was actually doing, if he was effectively a preparer of hides for making scrolls, then that is like the fact that he could read or write, that's fits a lot better with that. So anyway, that's my aside. I have no slides attached to it, but it does make a lot more historical sense that Paul was someone who he certainly could read or write, and therefore preparing hides for writing on seems to be quite a logical step. So As I said before, Jewish Christianity did continue to, still existed at this point in time, but we have far less primary documentation as to what that community looked like. We have a few, and I'll get to those eventually, but mostly the historical information that we have is what was happening in Asia Minor and Greece, as opposed to what was happening in and around Jerusalem, or for that matter, Alexandria and Egypt. So here's a few insights. So the other thing is, one of the things when we talk about Judaism wasn't just a single solidified monolithic religious tradition at all. In the first century, there were it was split, and it was there were at least 5 major factions that were often at odds with each other. And most of these you may be familiar with. Of course, you very likely have heard, like biblically, the ones that you've heard of are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and to a lesser extent, the Hellenists. The Hellenists aren't necessarily named per se, at least in the New Testament. But when you have, like, there are Greeks coming to meet with Jesus, chances are they are actually Hellenistic Jews. In other words, they're Greek-speaking Jews who have they've assimilated a lot of the Greek culture that existed at the time. And keep in mind, even though this is under the Roman Empire, the culturally, the Roman Empire, particularly in the East, was actually Greek. In fact, how many of you might have seen Mel Gibson's The Last Temptation of Christ? Or sorry, not The Last Temptation of Christ. No, that's Martin Scorsese. Not The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
Or as some of my secular friends would call it, the Jesus Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
And in that, Mel Gibson said, like, he had everybody, and he, like, Jesus speaking Aramaic to his followers, and the Romans were only speaking Latin, which any historian would look at that and say, look, they all spoke Greek, because Greek was the English equivalent of the day. That everybody spoke Greek, and so Ian, please. But everybody would have spoken Greek at the time, and whereas people who were from the Italian peninsula would have likely spoken Latin as well, but they would have spoken Greek, especially in the Eastern Empire. And Jesus grew up in Nazareth was only about 10 kilometers away from a major trading port called Sepphoris, which was a Greek town. So it's highly likely that Jesus was bilingual and spoke both Aramaic and Greek. So, but anyway, be that as it may, the major groups that you see, of course, are the Pharisees and Sadducees, the Essenes, whom aren't specifically named in the New Testament, or even necessarily in the Old Testament, because a lot of these traditions evolved after most of what we now know as the Hebrew Scriptures had largely solidified, and so these were different groups. And then the Essenes, it is speculated that John the Baptist himself was an Essene, because they were very much live away from the world, going out into the wilderness or in their own separate their own separate communities, and they were big into full immersion baptism, being washed, and that was a thing that the Essenes did. But the Essenes most famously today are understood to be the community that where the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found, the north of the Dead Sea, that they were at least a major center. They were the sect responsible for the writing and collecting and storing of these particular scrolls in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that was the Essenes, and the Zealots were basically the. Here's the thing: zealot today means religious nut. And zealots in that day and age were more like the thugs that used religion as their cudgel. Would be the better way to describe it. Is that they weren't actually all that religious, but boy, they were violent. And they were all about political power. And unfortunately, it was, a lot of what we have today. You can actually put a fair bit of blame on if you want to put a blame on anywhere, it would be with the zealots, not necessarily any of these other groups. Now, Christianity on itself was actually a minor but a messianic movement within Judaism itself. Effectively, it was a new movement that evolved out of this, but it shared some characteristics with the Pharisees and the Essenes and the Hellenists, but there were some zealots that were also part of that movement. So it seemed to kind of cross a lot of those barriers. But it was a movement inside Judaism, but it had some radical elements to it. And the thing is, one of the things that we can look at in terms of the development of early Christianity, at least initially, is of course the development of Christianity inside Judaism as a sect of its own. And that's where we have the Jewish Christians and probably people who were in one of those existing factions began to regard Jesus as that messianic figure that was expected from Scripture. But so many people had so many different ideas of what that would be. Like, for example, the Essenes in Qumran for the Dead Sea Scrolls expected not one Messiah but two, one political and one one more of as a religious leader. So it was kind of, they took that expectation and split it into two people. On the other hand, at least amongst the Zealots, for example, in the middle of the 2nd century, Simon Bar Kokhba and what's called the Bar Kokhba revolt sort of labeled him as Messiah, for example. But anyway, the Jewish Christian communities largely were centered around Jerusalem and Alexandria, because Alexandria itself had also become a center for exiled Judaism over the previous 500 years. So so you had these sort of two communities and that presence of ideas and where that would evolve. And you'll see some of this. Whereas on the other hand, the Gentile Christians, they were not originally part of Judaism, but they were very receptive to this message of Jesus. And specifically through the work of Paul, that the idea is that even within Judaism, there were people who were intrigued with Judaism. They wanted to become part of Judaism. And there's a phrase that was used called proselytes. In other words, people who were not Jewish but were studying Judaism. And so Paul, on the other hand, himself Jewish, himself self-declared as a Pharisee, to which he is very proud of. But he became a big advocate of seeing the person and work of Jesus as being, this is the vehicle through which that message can now come to the world as a whole. In other words, people who are not, you don't have to become Jewish to experience God's grace. You can simply through the work of Jesus, it's now for the world. That was Paul's theological stance. He often had arguments, and I'll get into that hopefully in a bit. That one, because there were a couple things within Judaism or within early Christianity. The question is, do you have to become Jewish in order to become Christian, or can you just simply be a follower of Christ without first becoming Jewish? And that was the question of identity. And so that's the question that we're working with here. Now, Paul firmly argued that the answer was no, and he did have open disagreements, which we know about, where Paul himself describes it, where he was in disagreement with early church leaders, especially Peter and James. Eventually, he managed to he managed to convince them that what he was doing was valid, and that people could be either Jewish or Gentile and be a follower of Christ. And that resolution probably came somewhere around, about 4 years before Paul penned his first letter. Because he in various letters he talks about what he did personally in terms of getting to that stage. But of course, the thing is, not everybody got that message, and there's several places, including with the Galatians and others, where he encounters other people going to these different communities in Asia Minor saying, yes, you need to convert to Judaism first before you can become a Christian, and particularly for you male folk, that involves a pair of scissors. And Paul was saying, no, you don't have to do that. But he often locked heads, locked horns with these, and stating specifically that, look, I had this conversation with Peter and James. We had our differences, but we had it out, and this is what the agreement was. So anyway, here's the map that I promised. So all of these little tiny dots all through here. Can everybody see this okay? Where you have a lot of those early cities that had New Testament churches. Now, when I say churches, these are groups of people, because at this point in time, none of this ever occurred inside of a dedicated worship space building. All of this was done in people's homes, in different places. Sometimes, eventually, they would even be apparently places to meet were crypts and mausoleums, which raised a few eyebrows fairly early on. But for the most part, they were meeting in different places. Now, we have a lot of these different ones, including, like, here you have like Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, and Philadelphia being and Laodicea being the churches of Revelation, for example, in terms of the different communities. The important ones to pay attention to, at least for this one, are Jerusalem, of course, here. We'll talk a bit about Pella, but I'll come back to that in a bit. But the primary ones are Jerusalem, Antioch, what will eventually be up here, which is eventually Constantinople. Currently, at this time, it would be Byzantium, but it's not actually there yet. Alexandria down here in Egypt, and of course Rome, all the way way out west. But these are these early churches in the New Testament. Oh yeah, Babylon's just off the side. But the ones to pay attention to, because these will come up later, are Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome. Eventually, when we get there. By the way, can you see my mouse moving around on here? Okay, good. I wasn't sure if that was the case, because I was sitting here pointing, and I was hoping that you wouldn't that you can actually see what I'm pointing at. So I want to talk a little bit about Jewish Christianity, because we do not know that much about early Jewish Christianity. We really don't. Like, from a point of view, from a historian's point of view, we have far fewer primary sources in comparison to the writings of Paul. And so what we have, the primary sources that we have for the Jewish Christian communities, only for their theological perspective and the community itself, come to us sort of indirectly through the Gospel and letters of John. But these are much later. These are like the end of the 1st century and the beginning of the 2nd century. And like I said, what they are is, even though these are telling the stories of Jesus many years before, there's certain elements of that if you have a certain degree of training, you're able to kind of pull out some things about that community. And so through that, people who study this more than I do and who are better at it than I am have made some educated guesses as to the basics of what Jewish Christianity at the time looked like. And basically, those communities existed primarily in Galilee and Jerusalem, not surprising. That they understood Jesus of Nazareth as a fulfillment of that expectation of Messiah. And the people who joined that were people who were slightly more secular, Essenes and Pharisees. And we also, it is very likely that some may have also been at one time or another involved directly with the Zealots, and may have been disaffected by the level of violence that the Zealots were often advocating. And so the other thing is, Hellenistic Jews themselves would have resonated well, of course, within this inclusive message of Jesus. And curiously enough, the Hellenistic Jews were the ones who then would pave the way for Christianity eventually splitting off and moving into Gentile, non-Jewish communities within a handful of years. And the thing is, even when there was a period of time where Gentile Christianity, largely thanks to Paul, and Jewish Christianity survived or thrived, and they existed in parallel to each other. But unfortunately, these movements were growing inside of a enormously dangerous political environment within Judea itself, and of course the overall arching existence and foot of the Roman Empire. And that eventually had its own huge impact, and we're going to get into that. And so we know that Jewish Christians for sure were very likely caught in the crossfire during the First Jewish-Roman War, which these dates are approximate. The First Jewish-Roman War is probably the most significant historical event in the development of Christianity that you've never heard of. I even did a video on it. And so, but what it eventually led to is the First Jewish-Roman War was saw the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and it has never been rebuilt. Okay. So like for example, you have the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. If any of you have ever been there, that is the last remnant of the temple that was originally destroyed, that the Babylonians originally destroyed 500 years before that. Then it was rebuilt and then expanded, and actually, curiously enough, under Herod the Great, expanded that temple enormously. But in the year 70, you had the First Jewish-Roman War was raging, and Jerusalem, the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem, and they destroyed, they severely damaged the city, and they destroyed the temple outright. And as I said before, it's never been rebuilt. And because of that destruction, the factions within Judaism that required the temple for their existence, in terms of their understanding, their theological understanding, they could not survive the destruction of the temple because it was so central to their way and mode of being. And specifically, that was the Sadducees and the Essenes. Even though the Essenes tend to be isolationists, they were very, very temple focused. And so the Sadducees and the Essenes as factions, pretty much within just a decade or so of the destruction of the temple, they ceased to be they ceased to be viable factions within Judaism. They effectively stopped. They just didn't exist anymore. I mean, exactly how long it took them to die out is unclear, but because a lot of their theological understanding was constructed around the existence and presence of the temple, those factions, as we knew them then, simply vanished. On the other hand, the Pharisees evolved into, because they didn't require the existence of a temple, and because they had these teaching locations that were known as synagogues, evolved into what we now know as Rabbinic Judaism in all of its different forms. So now keep in mind, unfortunately, in the New Testament, the Pharisees are often portrayed as the bad guys. And the reality is that they were probably, of all the factions, they were actually very, very, very close to what Jesus taught, and probably had a whole lot in common. And so, but they're often made out to be the mustache twirling villains that just kind of happen to show up to criticize Jesus at any given point. But that probably is that characterization is not would not necessarily be accurate, because largely, you had a whole bunch of different factions that were going on. And so, because of these different things and all these different political events that are going on around this, eventually what would happen, unfortunately, is that the Jewish stream of Christianity eventually began to wither and fade, and effectively would be then absorbed into what was now Gentile Christianity. And so, even though we do have Jewish Christian writings, namely the Gospel of John and the letters of John and Jude, are all representative of that element of it. So there's still vestiges of it. Largely, that overall movement had largely faded out by then. And so Jewish Christianity probably survived until about the early first century, but more or less by the time of the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was, depending on how you count it, either the second or the third Jewish-Roman War. Jewish Christianity as a distinct element of Christianity had pretty much faded away. And then, we know by the 4th century, it was almost completely gone. So what I want to do is do a little bit of here's your timeline. Now, I said dates aren't important, but here are some dates. So what you have here is this is largely a picture of what the picture of what what approximately the landscape looked like in and around up to about roughly 39. So very, very, very early on. And you have approximately between 30 and 33, that's the active ministry time of Jesus in Galilee. Really, it's a rural movement outside of the existing establishment. So it's not occurring within the various places of power. It's more of a, Jesus is this itinerant preacher from reputed to be a carpenter. But keep in mind, carpenters weren't the sort of respected trade people. They were the people who were so poor that they couldn't afford to work in the country, and so that they had to come to the city to find work, and in this case, working in with that. And so Jesus comes out of this working amongst Galilean locals, basically. And then we have, of course, the execution of Jesus. We have the crucifixion and the resurrection. Resurrection is a matter of is a point of faith that we take. And then for the next 7 years, you have this movement within Judaism that seems to be centered around Jerusalem, which is here, and Galilee, and part of it is some of it was what's called semi-apocalyptic. I don't like to use the phrase apocalyptic, because apocalyptic, the word apocalyptic in Greek means in Greek, where it means to reveal, not that the world's suddenly going to end. But in that sense, they were awaiting the revealing of God's presence, and many of them believed actively that Jesus would return within their lifetimes and immediately. And many of the early leaders were those who followed Jesus, of course, the disciples, but also many others. But also thanks largely to something called the diaspora, thanks to the groundwork that had largely been laid throughout the Roman Empire in terms of the ability to travel long distances, but also the existence of Jewish communities all throughout the Eastern Roman Empire that had existed for a long time, thanks largely to what the Babylonians did almost 5 centuries earlier. That there was the channels for this to spread in those directions already existed, and so that's how Christianity started to spread along this existing communications network. Now, keep in mind, communications doesn't mean something like this in terms of the internet. Rather, it is good roads and people walking, and sometimes even if they were lucky, by horseback, but most of the time it was on foot. Approximately 3 years after the crucifixion of Christ, we have the conversion of Paul, and Paul was both Jewish and a Roman citizen. Originally Paul of Tarsus, and by the way, I should have noted this before. I'm going to jump back to this map before I come back to the timeline. Is I'm going to pop over here and show you that Tarsus is right here. Okay, so we have Jerusalem down here, but specifically this is where Paul himself was from. So he actively lived in Asia Minor, and very likely he was that he's both Jewish and a Roman citizen. So he walks in both worlds at this point. Now, of course, Acts portrays him as a persecutor of Christians, and then he has this personal experience of the risen Christ on the road to Damascus and becomes a champion of the faith. The trouble is, as Acts in many respects is more like a kind of a romantic novel. It's written well after Paul was around, because Paul himself never mentions going to Damascus, but he does talk about a personal revelation and his change of heart, specifically in Galatians, and that spurred him to carry the message of Jesus to Asia Minor and Greece. So, whether it was on the road to Damascus, we're not entirely sure, but we do know that something happened. And so that's one that Paul himself saw himself even as a persecutor of the church, but then eventually became one of its greatest advocates. And so between 36 and 54, Paul is doing all this stuff, but he's doing it by going and being present with people. So there's no need for him to write letters at this point in time, because he's meeting people and they're in process of founding communities. And then all of a sudden, in these communities as they get there's more and more of them, his ability to be present with them becomes more and more difficult. And so, we know that he was involved in the founding of the church communities in Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, and Galatia, but also probably many others. And because of his involvement in there, of course, he couldn't be everywhere at once. And then when it became a problem that he couldn't travel to each of these individual ones, that he would start writing letters. And he was now we're understanding is that Paul himself was based he based himself in Ephesus, which means I've got to go back to this map here. And Ephesus is right here. So if Jerusalem is there, Tarsus is here. By the time that Paul is active, he is in Ephesus. So he helps found churches, not just in Ephesus, in Corinth, which is here, Thessalonica, Philippi, and then of course Galatia is sort of largely thought to be somewhere in this area, closer to the Black Sea. But he's also in different places. So let's just make sure I got to get back to my. Okay, and then we also know that there were other communities in this, but unclear who founded them. For example, we know that there was a church growing in Rome. Paul was not involved in the founding of that, by the way. But somewhere around this right in the middle of the first century, so approximately 27 years after the crucifixion of Christ, there was a meeting of some sort happening in Jerusalem where the disciples, the apostles, Paul is meeting with them. Particularly, we know specifically he met with James and Peter and James about recognizing Paul's specific ministry to the non-Jewish people who wanted to follow Christ. And so one of the major questions that they did resolve at this is that do Gentiles have to first become Jewish in order to follow Jesus? And Paul advocated for and eventually got agreement of that. No, you didn't have to become Jewish first. But the thing is, we have these two major streams existing: Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity. But a large of these, Paul didn't do all the heavy lifting all by himself. All of these movements spread by word of mouth and by individuals, many of their names lost to history, but they were the ones who did all the heavy lifting. Paul provided some guidance and some writing, as did and that support, but he couldn't be everywhere in a place. So Christianity often was spreading well beyond just these individual people who are often lauded as the heroes of the faith. There were many others, men and women, and we know this especially from Paul's own writing, especially the involvement of the huge involvement of women in the earliest stages of the church, which was quite revolutionary because at the time, this whole area was very, very patriarchal. Women did not have any rights, and yet there were a few individuals that especially that we know of, and we know from Paul's writing that he saw them as equals. And so one of the things Christianity is often portrayed of, it spread like wildfire. It's kind of like, no, it was more like yeast in bread, gently growing. And so anyway, by the time that Paul starts to write his first letters, Paul is already an established authority in that early non-Jewish branch of the church. And of course, with any human organization, you have conflicts beginning to arise. and certain theological issues, and they would turn to Paul for some guidance. So one example, the big one, which is the big central issue for First Thessalonians, is this belief and understanding that Christ would return within the lifetime of believers. But the thing is, as time went on, people were aging and they were dying. And so they were writing Paul, well, what's going on? Have you sold us a bill of goods? And so First Thessalonians is that response there. And then Paul himself preferred to travel in person to resolve these issues. But when he couldn't be there, when he couldn't be there in person because of another obligation, or he was, in one case, in prison, he would write letters. Now, First Thessalonians, he did not write from prison. I do want to make that clear. And so what he then over time, that's the first thing that he started to address. But Paul himself began to change into that understanding of not that Christ would return in our lifetime, and he effectively, especially we see that change, like in First Thessalonians, he did believe that. By the time that he got to his next letter, to the Philippians, which he was in prison when he wrote that one, that he eventually he had his perspective and theological understanding had changed, and he then saw this as a movement to eventually embrace that had potential to be far more wide-reaching than even he had thought. And so he then began to express a vision of going past the comfort of the world that he knew, particularly around the Aegean Sea and in Asia Minor, and eventually saw himself of continuing to the far reaches of the world of the earth, namely at this point in time what we now know as Spain, and he would use Rome as his base of operations. And so in preparation for that, he writes this letter to the church that's already established in Rome, and says, hey, I'd like to come there and use this as a base for me to then move further west. But we know he never made it to Spain. We know he got as far as Rome, and that's where but he never made it to Spain, because it's kind of hard to go to Spain when you're missing your head. So what even though Acts describes, now keep in mind, Acts itself as a historical source is not as reliable as we would like it to be, but there is this description of he is brought to Rome, to stand trial. Details are unclear, but we don't know if it was under like Paul himself says, I want to go to Rome because I see this as a place for me to have this new base of operations to move further west. So I'm of the mind that he came there voluntarily, as opposed to being brought in chains there. But there's this important distinction prior to the First Jewish-Roman War. So all this is happening in Paul's life. All this is happening prior to the First Jewish-Roman War. Because by the time the First Jewish-Roman War breaks out, Paul is already dead. But prior to 64, Christians are unnoticed by political authorities outside of, it's just, at best, they're seen as kind of as an offshoot of a faction within Judaism, even the ones who were clearly not Jewish themselves, as being, they didn't quite know what to do with them. But of course, famously in 64, there was a major fire in Rome, and guess who the emperor happened to be? Nero, supposedly fiddling while Rome burned. And, of course, Nero was widely suspected of ordering it, but to deflect blame, Christians were a convenient goat. And of course, several Christians were tortured and executed in the aftermath of this. And it is her first non-Christian mention of Christians in terms of historical in this case. Now, probably it is likely that Paul and Peter would have been executed during this time, in terms of what is recorded as the first persecution of Christians in terms of recorded history, as opposed to, the stoning of Stephen, for example, in Acts, being more of an regarded as an internal dispute. This is a case of where you have the empire actually noticing things. Now at this point, Christianity and Judaism are still the distinction between them is not clear, but they are in process of evolving in different directions. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, identifies Christianity as a distinct group. But the thing is, it's unclear, because, of course, during the First Jewish-Roman War, which I'm going to get to actually in the next slide, brings us to that point. So, First Jewish-Roman War, the most important conflict you've never heard of. And what you need to understand about the First Jewish-Roman War is that it happened, these are the approximate dates with it. You've probably heard about some of the elements of this, is that there is, over time, and this started well before even Jesus was around, and was brewing during Jesus' time, because you have this revolt in the Judean province that is brewing and growing, and then finally it gets bad enough that it catches Rome's attention. Now, what you have is this radical faction of zealots who gain political influence and power in and around Jerusalem, much to the chagrin of the Romans. And eventually, the zealots, through various terrorist attacks and what have you, attack the Romans, and eventually becomes like they actually take over Jerusalem, kicking out the Romans and declaring themselves independent, sort of in the vein of what happened the more than a century before with the Maccabean revolt, where when that happened, Israel managed to displace the Greek Seleucid Empire from control, and they became an independent state for a good number of years, granted assisted by the Roman Republic at the time. That romanticization of that period, that they wanted to go back to that. And then, of course, this happens in the First Jewish-Roman War. Vespasian goes to put down this insurrection, but the reality is that this insurrection wasn't against Rome. It was actually about a control over Jerusalem. And so it was actually a local civil war. The zealots basically, anybody who was not with them was considered to be with the Romans. And so groups like the Sadducees, who were and some elements of the Pharisees even were seen to be as collaborating with the Romans. And so there was really, it was a lot of infighting. And then the Romans came to put it down. And so the Romans are getting involved in a civil war. One of the things from the point of view of military history is, if there's one thing that you really don't want to get involved in, is an external power getting involved in a civil war. And you just need to think of like Vietnam, for example, is a modern example of this. But unfortunately, the end result was the Romans destroyed the temple but the Zealots themselves, even though Jerusalem is destroyed, they flee to the fortress of Masada, which is south. And you've probably heard, this is the battle you may have heard about. That this is where the Zealots themselves, the last of them, went and held up where the Romans laid. It's at the top of this mountainous formation, and the Romans really decided to take it. So they, over a course of a year, built a ramp up to lay siege. They eventually get in, and then they find that everybody has died by suicide, or at least that's and as it goes. And in the aftermath of the Jewish-Roman War, you have the Zealots, the Sadducees, and the Essene factions basically collapse, because the Zealots, because they're basically politically they're wiped out. Sort of a neo-Zealot movement eventually develops into the Bar Kokhba revolt, but really that would be the last vestiges of it. But the Sadducees and the Essenes basically are gone. And of course, Christians at this point in time were such a small minority, but they ended up getting caught in the crossfire because they're seen as Roman collaborators by the Zealots, because many of them were Gentile, and even those who were Jewish often took on appearances of looking more Greek-like themselves. But of course, the Romans saw them all as Jewish, and sort of this, kill them all, let Zeus sort them out, sort of thing, or let Hades sort them out, I guess. And so early on in the conflict, the early Christians decided that we need to get out of Dodge, and so they fled to the city of Pella, which I need to go all the way back to my little reference slide here. And you can see Pella is up here, and so they basically flee Jerusalem to Pella, where they managed to hold out. Let's see. Okay, and I'm just getting this. So they flee to Pella, and at this point in time, early Christianity ceased to be centered around Jerusalem, even though there was a group that would eventually continue to operate in Jerusalem, but Pella was more the center. And really, the first Jewish-Roman War is probably the first place where you can actually mark a distinct where Judaism and Christianity were largely, at this point in time, they were going their own separate ways. And the first Jewish-Roman War didn't cause the split because it was really in process of evolving apart. But by the time of the first Jewish-Roman War, they were starting to become distinct from each other. And because of the results of the first Jewish-Roman War, and we're going to get to that next time, is that they do become more distinct in that aftermath. So what we're going to talk about next week is Christianity in the Roman Empire, and the approximate date range we're working with here is from about 74 to about the beginning of the 4th century. We always have to remind ourselves is that when you're talking about the century, you have to take the year and then add it, sort of round it down and then add a number. So 305 is the 4th century, because 350 is the middle of the 4th century, whereas 50 is the middle of the 1st century. And one of the questions here the Christians began to ask is that question of what do we believe, and that's what we're going to be addressing next week. So any questions? I realize I've been kind of going at this pretty hard with a couple of questions, but we're also at about 20. I did promise to get through this by 8:30.
Yeah.
So, but any questions that you might have of anything that I touched on tonight?
I was quite surprised at just how much I knew, which means I've obviously been listening to you.
Well, that's encouraging.
Well, with the amount of courses I've taken so far,
Mm,
I'm surprised that I'm aware of where it is we're at. I'm just after specifics myself, but that's
Yeah.
okay.
mm. So any other questions, Beryl, Joy, Donna, Megan?
Quiet as church mice.
Yes.
Quiet as church mice. No, I have no questions. It was very interesting. Thank you.
So
It was just interesting hearing you talk about. I always think of like the world wars, but you're talking about it in a different sense tonight, and I was just interesting hearing about that.
yeah. Well, and when you get to say something like the first Jewish-Roman War, which of course was, middle of the first century, and yet so much of that conflict affected the development of Christianity, but of course it's not something that shows up in the literature that we normally study, namely the Bible, even though it did have an effect on that, and the for various reasons. I mean, some of it is hinted at like, for example, in Mark chapter 13, Jesus talks about, we have Jesus portrayed as talking about looking at the everything in Jerusalem and these wonderful buildings, and Jesus says, "Oh, that's all going to get knocked down." That's one of the reasons why scholars often place that somewhere close to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And that there is a certain layering of some of that imagery within the Gospels, in terms of destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days, kind of thing. That those elements are little, almost literary verbal cues, hinting at something that is going on, but without them necessarily saying, "Hey, this is what it's about," because they need to be a lot more circumspect at this time in terms of what they actually say out loud. So, and what you're getting there isn't so much the historical elements of the life and ministry of Jesus, but an insight into the communities around which early Christianity is developing. Because there's always that element of both, and more often we're focused on the life and work of Jesus without realizing there's also this historical filter that we're looking through, and sometimes looking at that filter is also just as interesting. So, as I said, I'm largely for this, I'm wearing mostly the historian's hat. But there's always that element of, and probably next week we're going to be talking more in terms of, like, there will be always elements of theological understanding that will come through this as well. Like, for example, I've not mentioned anything about development of creeds or that kind of thing. That comes later.
Well, it's good not to hit us all at the same time, because you can overload people.
Oh, yeah. No,
Overload. You're right.
and I mean, I remember some of my courses at seminary, and I like I just come out of those and going, my brain is full.
Well, if I can't sleep tonight, John, it's all your fault. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. So, anyway, I will see everyone next week. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.
Where are we here? So stop